The station smelled like something burning. Not fire, not danger, just metal and heat and recycled air that had passed through 100 different alien lungs before it reached her as Mara Voss stood at the entry gate of Kareth. 9 and breathed it in anyway. She had smelled worse. She had survived worse. She was 22 years old. She carried one bag. She had a small scar above her left eyebrow from a training accident back on Earth, and she had not slept in 31 hours. She looked at the massive glowing arch above the gate that read in 12 galactic languages, "Welcome to the Interspecies Academy." And she felt nothing dramatic. She just picked up her bag and walked inside. That was the thing about Mara. Nobody ever expected her to be what she was. The Academy was the most respected school in the known galaxy. Over 400 species sent their best and brightest here. Doctors, engineers, diplomats, soldiers, scientists. The hallways were wide enough to fit 3 Earth buses side by side. Because some of the enrolled species needed that kind of space, the ceiling was so high that Mara had to tilt her head all the way back to see if she did not tilt her head. She just kept walking. She was one of 3 humans ever admitted in the Academy's 900-year history. She had read that number 3 times before her departure, and each time it felt less like an honor and more like a warning. Her dormitory was on level 7, corridor C room 14. She found it without asking anyone for directions. She had memorized a map 2 weeks before arrival. That was another thing about Mara. She prepared. She always prepared. The room had 3 sleeping spaces. One was already claimed a tall, pale green. Being stood near the far wall, arranging small crystalline objects on a shelf with 4 thin arms that turned when Mara entered, and she saw that it had no eyes where eyes should be, but 2 long antennae that swiveled toward her like satellite dishes locking onto a signal. Thesic said its name was Thesic. It was Vrithian. Its species communicated through sound and pheromone bursts, and a very precise clicking of its jaw plates that spoke the galactic common language in a voice like dry leaves and wind. The 3rd roommate arrived an hour later. Orendal was Molthene, and looked like someone had poured warm amber honey into a tall glass, and taught it to think Molthenes were empathic. They did not just sense emotions, they absorbed them like sponges pulled in water. Orendal moved carefully, slowly, the way beings moved when they were always feeling everything around them. Mara shook both their hands, or tried. Thesic had no hands. Orendal had something like hands, but they rippled when she touched them, and he made a soft sound she could not identify. She apologized. He said there was no need. He said he could already feel that she meant well. That night the 3 of them sat in the common hall for the orientation meal, and Mara watched the room. There were beings of every shape and size and color. Some had shells, some had 6 legs, some floated slightly above their seats, some ate light directly through their skin panels. A small reptilian student 3 tables away was eating what appeared to be a live electrical current with calm satisfaction. Nobody looked at each other, like it was strange. That was a galaxy diverse, used to itself, comfortable in its own complexity. Nobody looked at Mara either, not at first. But she caught at the small double glance, the pause, the slight lean toward a neighbor, and the whisper. She had good eyes, and she could read body language and species she had never met before. Because body language was mostly the same everywhere. Something tightened. When you were unsure, something softened. When you were curious, something turned away. When you did not want to be caught looking. She was a curiosity of the room, and everyone was pretending she was not. The next morning, she attended her first class, combat physiology, taught by Professor. Again, he was Drackery tall, scaled dark green with gold eyes that had seen more centuries than Mara's entire civilization had existed. He moved with the slow certainty of something that had never once in his life been afraid of what was in the room with it. He welcomed the new cohort. He called the roll. He did not treat Mara's name differently from anyone else's, but she noticed a brief pause before he said it, the same pause a person makes before saying a word in a language they are not sure they are pronouncing correctly. He explained the semester. He explained that in 2 weeks they would begin pain calibration exercises, standard curriculum, a galactic tool used in medical and military training for centuries. A neurohaptic induction device would send a controlled pain signal into each student's nervous system. The device measured biological stress response. It had automatic shutoffs for every known species. It was safe, it was precise, it was boring to most of them. The alien students around Mara nodded. They had heard of this. Most had done versions of it in their home academy's routine. Mara wrote it down in her notes. After class in the corridor, she passed 2 Vrithian students, talking. They did not know she understood enough Vrithian dialect to catch the shape of conversation. They were betting on how many seconds a human would last before the device shut off automatically. One of them clicked what passed for a laugh. The other waved an antenna in dismissal. as if the question was not even worth discussing. Mara stopped walking. She stood still in the corridor for exactly 3 seconds. Then she kept walking, and she smiled. Not the smile of someone who had not heard, not the smile of someone who did not care. It was quieter than that, and older. It was a smile of someone who had been underestimated so many times that it had stopped feeling like an insult and started feeling like information. That evening, Thesic asked her why she had chosen to come to the academy. What was she studying? She told him crisis medicine. And in interspecies trauma response, he asked if humans had a lot of trauma. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. She said yes. She said humans have been building civilizations on top of their own disasters for 10,000 years. She said pain was not new to her people. She said they had gotten very good at it. Thesic was quiet for a moment. His antennae moved slowly, like they were processing something difficult. Then Orendal spoke from his bunk. His voice was soft like something dissolving in warm water. He said he could feel something from her, something he had never felt from any other student before. He said he did not have a word for it in common language. He said the closest thing in Mothine was a term that meant the warmth left in a stone after the fire has already gone out. Mara looked at him. She did not ask what he meant. She already knew. The morning of the calibration, nobody talked much. That was how Mara knew it actually meant something to them. Even the species that communicated in noise were quieter than usual. The Vrethian students clicked, lest the Mothine students moved more carefully. The large amphibious being from the death system, who usually hummed a constant low vibration that rattled the breakfast trays, was completely silent. They were not afraid, not exactly something more like the feeling before a test you had studied for, but were still not sure about that thin edge between confidence and the body quietly reminding you that it was paying attention. Mara ate her breakfast. She ate all of it. The biometrics lab was on level 3. It was cold and white and smelled like clean electricity. 12 neural interface pods sat in 2 rows like open chairs with too many wires attached to them. Professor Gen stood at the front beside a long console and explained what they already knew. The NHID would activate the signal, would climb in steps. Each student's pod was individually calibrated to their species biology. The device would read their biometrics in real-time heart rate neural response. Cellular stress markers the moment the readings crossed the automatic threshold line. The device would stop. No pain would last longer than the body could manage safely. He called it the most controlled discomfort in the known galaxy. He said it almost warmly, the way a doctor says this will only take a moment. He called the first student. A Drakari cadet named Sovereign went first tall and scaled like a younger version of Gen himself. He sat in the pod. He was connected. He looked bored. The device activated. His jaw tightened. Once his tail moved once and the machine stopped, and he stepped out and looked at his claws as if checking for something he had briefly misplaced. One by one, the alien students, when the Vrethians locked their leg joints and vibrated slightly, and were done in under a minute. The Govan student Korik, large as a doorway and covered in thick dark fur, barely reacted at all. He sat down. The machine ran. He stood up. He looked like he had been waiting for a shuttle. Orendal, when he was the most interesting to watch, his amber form rippled like something was moving through water just under his surface. His emotional absorption meant he felt the signal differently than the others. He felt it deeper. He shuddered. He made a sound like someone sighing underwater. But he finished. He stepped out of the pod, and his eyes found Mara. Immediately something in his expression said, I did not enjoy that. Then Professor Gen called her name. The room shifted, not loudly. Nobody moved dramatically, but something changed in the air. The attention moved the way attention does when everyone is pretending they are not watching, but they are all watching. Mara walked to the pod and sat down. She was connected to the sensors. She could feel them reading her already, her heart rate, her temperature, the small electrical map of her nervous system. Gen stood at the console, and she saw him quietly reduce the starting intensity before he activated it. She did not say anything about that. The device turned on. It started low warmth at first, moving through her like a current that had not yet decided to be unpleasant. Then it climbed the first real signal hit, and she felt the way you feel a burn before the skin actually breaks, hot and direct and honest. She breathed and breathed out. Her heart rate spiked on Gein's screen. She could see the readout from where she sat. She watched the number go up. The device climbed to the level that had made the Vrethians vibrate. She gripped the armrest. She breathed. It climbed to the level that had made Orendal shudder. Her jaw tightened. She breathed. It reached the Govan threshold, the level that was considered the edge of what physically powerful species experienced. The level Korik had passed through without blinking. Mara felt it like something was pressing a hot iron into the center of her bones. She felt her whole body trying to decide what to do with this information. Her hands were white on the armrest. A single bead of sweat ran from her temple to her jaw. She breathed in, and she smiled. It was not a performance. It was not brave posturing. It was a smile that came from somewhere older than thought to part her, that had been built by every generation that came before her, every human who had ever been cold and kept moving, every human who had ever been hurt and stayed standing, every human who had ever looked at pain in the face and said, "Not yet." The alien students at the observation glass were completely still. She heard nothing from them, nothing from Gen, nothing from a room. The only sound was a low hum of the machine and her own steady breathing. The device kept climbing. It went past the Drackery threshold, the level that Professor Gen, the oldest and strongest being in the room, would have felt in his ancient bones. Mara's hands were shaking slightly. The readout showed her heart rate at nearly double normal. Her neural response markers were spiking in patterns a machine had likely never recorded from a human before. Her cells were screaming in the clean scientific language of overwhelming stimulus. But she was still in the chair. She was still breathing. She was still smiling. And then the machine stopped, not because her biometrics crossed the safety threshold. The machine stopped because it had nothing left to give. It had reached the absolute top of its output scale, the maximum level of the ceiling that no one had ever reached, because no one had ever needed to go that high. The NHID had been used in this academy for 400 years on hundreds of species, and it had never once maxed out its scale. Until now. The silence in that room was not ordinary silence. It was a silence of understanding arriving somewhere it had never been before. Mara sat still for a moment, then she disconnected her own sensors. She stood up, she rolled her left shoulder, once the way you do when something is sore, but manageable. She turned to look at Professor Gen. His golden eyes were fixed on her with an expression she had never seen on a Drackery face, and she suspected very few people ever had. She looked at the console. She looked at the flat line at the top of the output graph. Then she looked again and asked in a perfectly level voice if there was a higher setting. Nobody in the room made a sound. Korik, the Govan student who had not reacted to anything all morning, was staring at her with his enormous dark eyes, and his mouth was open slightly. Thesic stood at the glass, and his antennae were completely motionless, which for a Vrethian meant only one thing. His brain had stopped processing and had not started again yet. Professor Gen set down the tablet he was holding very carefully. He clasped his hands behind his back. He looked at Mara Voss, who was 22 years old, who had one bag, who had a small scar above her eyebrow, and he said in a voice that was quieter than his usual voice. He said, "No, Cadet Voss, there is not a higher setting." He paused. He said, "There has never needed to be one before." Word traveled the way words always travel, in closed spaces. By the time Mara returned to her room that evening, the whole dormitory floor already knew. By the next morning, the whole Level 7 knew. By the afternoon of the following day, she was fairly certain the cafeteria workers knew, because one of them gave her an extra portion without being asked and then looked away quickly as if pretending it had not happened. She did not feel like a legend. She felt like someone who was behind on her reading assignments and needed to find a quiet corner. She did not get a quiet corner. Thesic found her first. He appeared beside her in the corridor of the morning after calibration, walking at her pace, which meant taking one of his long strides for every two of hers. He was quiet for a while, and she let it be quiet. She had learned already that Vrethians process things physically first. They worked it through the body before they brought it to the mouth. He finally asked her the simplest version of the question. He asked if she had been in pain. She said yes. He asked why she had smiled. She was quiet for a moment, not because she did not know the answer, but because she wanted to give him the real one, and the real one took a moment to find the right shape in common language. She said, because it meant she was not done yet. She said when it still hurt, it meant she was still there. And as long as she was still there, she still had a chance. And as long as she had a chance, there was nothing to do but keep going. Thesic walked beside her in silence for another full minute. His antennae moved in slow circles the way they did when he was working something out then. He said that where he came from, pain meant the body was failing. He said his people believed if something hurt that badly, you were supposed to stop. Mara nodded. She said she understood that. She said most species in the galaxy seemed to work that way. She said humans had not had that option, not for a very long time. Later that day, a Molthene student named Yessa came to find her. Yessa was smaller than Orendal and more gold and amber. She sat across from Mara in the common hall, and folded her soft hands together and looked at her with the kind of directness that only deeply empathic beings could manage, because they already knew you were not going to lie to them. They could feel the truth before you spoke it. Yessa said she had been standing at the observation glass during the calibration. She said she was empathic enough to absorb ambient emotion from across a room. She said what she felt coming off Mara during those final minutes of the NHID session had been so overwhelming that she had to step back from the glass. She said she had stood in the corridor with her back against the wall and breathed for several minutes after. She asked Mara how she had stayed conscious. Mara explained it the way she had been taught to explain it: military conditioning. She said the Earth military trained its people to manage pain as information rather than instruction. She said they learned to separate the signal from the command the body says stop. The mind decides whether to listen. She said there was also something older than training, something that did not come from any academy or any sergeant or any manual. She said it came from 10,000 years of being human, being the species on a violent planet that had no armor, no venom, no natural weapon, but kept surviving anyway. She said humans had developed a relationship with pain that most species never needed to develop, because most species had something to protect them. Humans had nothing, so they learned to carry it instead. Yessa was quiet for a long time. Then she said she thought that was one of the most heartbreaking things she had ever heard. Mara said most humans would call it Tuesday. Yessa did not understand the reference, but she felt the spirit of it, and she made a sound that was the Molthine version of a sad laugh. Professor again called Mara to his office on the third day. His office was large and old and smelled like documents and something that burned slowly and sweetly in a small dish near the window. The walls held physical records, the kind printed on material, not screens. His desk was covered in tablets, and the tablets were covered in numbers. Mara recognized the NHID output charts before he said a word. Gen did not waste time on small conversation. He was too old for it. He pulled up 4,000 years of calibration records from the Academy and 17 other institutions across 12 star systems. He showed her the graph: every species, every session, every recorded maximum output reached in 4,000 years across hundreds of species and tens of thousands of individual sessions. The NHID top scale had never once been touched, not by Drackery, not by Govan, not by any of the species. The galaxy considered physically dominant, until a 22-year-old human woman from a planet that had been in space for barely 3 centuries sat down and asked if there was a higher setting. Gen asked her the academic version of the question. He asked what in human evolutionary biology explained this. Mara leaned back in her chair. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about how to say it clearly. She said her planet had spent billions of years perfecting ways to end life before humans were fully human. Their ancestors were prey things with teeth and size and speed, were hunting them things in the water, things in the dark, things in the plants they ate. She said the humans who survived were not the fastest or the strongest. They were the ones who kept going after they were hurt, the ones who dragged themselves out of the dirt one more time. She said pain had been the defining condition of human existence for so long that it had stopped being a signal to stop and started being proof that the job was not finished. She said pain was just information. It meant she was still alive. It meant she still had work to do. Gen was quiet for a very long time. He looked at the data. He looked at her. He looked at the data again. Then he said in a voice that was lower than usual that she was a very strange species. He said he meant that as the highest compliment he knew how to give. That night, Mara lay in her bunk and stared at the ceiling. She was tired, not from the calibration, not from the questions, just tired the way you get when you've been explaining yourself for 3 days straight. She was almost asleep when Orendal spoke from across the room. His voice was barely a sound, more like a thought that had decided to become words. He asked her if it ever stopped on her planet. He asked if the pain ever stopped. The room was dark and quiet and honest in the way rooms get late at night, when the walls stopped pretending. She said no. She said it never really stopped. She said humans just stopped letting it be the reason they quit. Long silence. Then Orendal said that was the most frightening thing he had ever heard. Mara closed her eyes. She did not tell him she had heard that before. She did not tell him. She thought he was probably right. She just let the darkness sit the way she had learned to let hard things sit, quietly, without asking them to leave. Varith Minor smelled like hot rock and something that had been alive recently and was not anymore. It was the Academy simulation moon, a small gray body within atmosphere and high ultraviolet radiation and terrain that seemed personally offended by the idea of anyone walking on the rocks where sharp the ground was, uneven the sky was a pale, washed-out color that made everything look like an old photograph of a place no one had wanted to photograph. The annual survival and adaptation trial lasted 72 hours. Students were split into mixed species groups and dropped at various points across the moon with basic equipment, and one director survived together. Mara had been assigned to a group of 3. Thesic she already knew. Thesic she knew how he thought, how he moved, how his antennae gave away, what his face. Could not she trusted him the way you trust someone who has surprised you in a good direction. The third member was Korik. Korik was Govan. He was large the way a door is large. He stood nearly 3 meters tall and was covered in thick dark fur that his species had evolved over millions of years. Because their home world was cold enough to stop most other forms of life, the Govan were considered the physically dominant species. In the current cohort, strong, fast, dense muscle and bone structure that could take impacts that would destroy most beings their pain threshold in. The calibration had barely registered, because their armor of fur and their thick layered hide meant their bodies almost never experienced real injury. Korik was proud, not arrogant proud in the way that beings are proud when their whole biology has spent a long time winning. He looked at Mara, the way most physically large things look at small things, not with cruelty, just with a quiet, casual arithmetic of size. She was not insulted. She was used to it. For the first 20 hours the trial went well. They moved efficiently. Thesic could read environmental chemical signals and warned them twice about unstable ground. Korik could carry everything and did so without complaint. Mara navigated. She had memorized the terrain maps. She knew where the elevation changed, where the water sources were the safest overnight positions, so that she did not need to explain this. She just moved, and they followed because she was right. On the second day, they reached the deep ravine section where the geological survey said the rock was solid. The geological survey was wrong. The sinkhole opened without warning. One moment Korik was walking 3 steps ahead of her. The next, the ground under him dropped 2 meters of rock shelf, cracked and tilted and came down, and Korik went with it. He did not fall all the way. He was too large. He was wedged in the gap with the rock shelf across his lower body, pinning his left leg against the rubble below. He made a sound Mara had not heard from him before. She had heard Korik talk. She had heard him eat. She had heard him laugh once at something. Thesic said the laugh had shaken the room slightly. This sound was different. This was a Govan discovering for the first time in his life that his body could be truly hurt. He was screaming, not in pain, exactly not the way humans scream from pain. The Govan had evolved with such effective biological armor that their pain response system had never been fully tested. The signal was going in, but there was no learned way to manage it, no conditioning, no history of it, no muscle memory of surviving it. He was going to shock his body, did not know what to do with information it had never received before. The rescue beacon would take 40 minutes. Mara looked at the rock shelf. She looked at the angle. She looked at the gap. She did the math without a calculator and without paper, just in her head, the way her instructors had taught her and the way her grandmother had taught her before any instructor ever got the chance. The shelf was too heavy to lift alone. It was solid compressed rock, roughly 2 tons, maybe slightly more. Even Korik, at full strength, probably could not have lifted it. She looked at Thesic. She said his name once. He was already staring at the rock, his antennae rigid. He looked at her. She asked him whether his bioacid secretion could weaken dense mineral compounds. She knew it because she had read Vrethian biology. She just needed him to hear his own answer come out of his own mouth. He said yes. She said start on the left edge where the shelf meets the wall. She said do not stop. She looked at Yessa. Yessa was not in her assigned group. Yessa had been 300 meters away on a parallel route. When the ground fell, she felt the emotional shockwave of Korik going into shock from that distance and had run toward it without thinking. Mara looked at her. She said Korik was going into neurological shock because the species had no experience managing acute pain. She said his own body was going to hurt him worse than the rock if they could not calm his nervous system. She said Yessa was the only one who could do that. She said push calm into him, whatever that meant for morphine, whatever you have, do it. Yessa moved to Korik. Without another word, she put both her soft, rippling hands against the side of his face and closed her eyes, and whatever she did, it worked. Within 30 seconds, his screaming dropped to a shuddering, broken whimper. His eyes still showed panic, but his body stopped fighting. Then Mara got on the ground. She pressed herself flat against the rock and worked her right arm into the gap under the shelf. The space was barely enough. She pushed her arm in up to the shoulder and then angled her body and pressed up. The shelf moved. Not far, not much, maybe 4 centimeters, maybe less. But it moved. The wave of it went through her arm like fire. Her shoulder joint screamed. The bones in her forearm pressed against each other in a way they were not designed to press. She felt the specific sensation of something bending that was not supposed to bend. She had felt it before training year 2. She knew what it meant. She knew what was going to come after. She did not stop. She looked at Korik. His eyes found her face. He was still shaking, but he was looking at her. He was focusing on her the way people focus on something when everything else is too much and they need one solid point. She spoke to him. She kept her voice completely level. She said, hey. She said, look at her. She said she had him. She said this was going to be over very soon, and he was going to be fine, and she needed him to just keep his eyes open and keep looking at her. Her arm was being crushed. Her voice did not shake. Thesic worked the rock edge with everything. He had the acid cut slowly, too slowly. But it cut. Mara felt the shelf shudder as when the contact points weakened. She pushed harder. The bones in her forearm were talking to her very loudly, and she did not respond. 30 minutes later, when the shelf finally shifted enough, and Korik pulled his leg free, and the shelf came down, and Mara's arm came out, she sat back against a ravine wall and looked at her forearm. It was already swelling. The bruising was coming up under the skin in dark shapes. She pressed 2 fingers against the site and felt the small crackle that meant what she already knew it meant. Hairline fracture of the radius. She pressed her back against the wall and breathed. When the shuttle arrived 17 minutes later, the medics found Korik unconscious. But stable, they found Thesic standing very still with his antennae held low. They found Yessa sitting beside Korik with her hands still on his face and her eyes still closed. They found Mara sitting against the wall with a fractured arm eating a protein ration bar from her pack. She told the medic she was fine before he asked. He looked at her arm. He looked at her face. He opened his mouth. She handed him half the protein bar. He did not know what to do with this information, so he took it. In the medical bay on the shuttle, Korik regained consciousness. Slowly, his leg was fractured in 2 places, and his body was still processing the shock of the experience. He looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then he turned his head, and Mara was sitting in the next bed with her arm wrapped and her eyes open. He looked at her for a long time with his enormous dark eyes, the eyes of a species that had never needed to be afraid of anything. Then he reached out one of his enormous paws, both of them actually, and he wrapped them around her small wrapped hand, and he held on. He did not say anything. Neither did she. Thesic stood in the doorway of the medical bay. He looked at them both. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the stars through the small porthole window. Then quietly, to no one in particular, he said he thought he finally understood why humans had survived their planet. Nobody corrected him. Nobody had anything better to say. The end of term ceremony was held in the main hall on level 1. It was the largest room on the station, and it was full. Every seat taken, every tier of the gallery filled the hall, had been designed to hold beings of 50 different sizes and shapes. So it did not look like any ceremony room Mara had ever seen back on Earth. It looked more like a city had been folded up and told to sit down. There were beings perched on high rails, and beings resting in pools built into the floor, and beings hovering at eye level on slow personal lift fields, and somewhere near the back, a species that perceived the world entirely through vibration had brought their own floor panels, which they tapped lightly with their feet to feel the ceremony happening. Mara sat in the 3rd row between Thesic and Orendau. Her arm still had the brace on it. Would for another 2 weeks. The fracture had been cleaned and was healing well. The Academy doctor had said your species heals with remarkable speed. He had said, writing it down in his notes like it was useful data, which she had not told him it was fairly ordinary. She had decided to let him have the small wonder of it. The ceremony worked through most of the standard recognitions: academic achievement, field performance, diplomatic contributions. The beings around her applauded in their various ways. Some clicked, some vibrated, some released small bursts of colored light from their skin. Some simply sat very still, which for certain species was the loudest form of approval. Then Professor Gen walked to the front. He was not a being who changed his pace for anything. He walked away mountains, sat still in a way that made everything else around him seem briefly uncertain. He stood behind the speaker platform and looked out the hall, and was quiet for long enough that the entire room settled into a different kind of attention. He said he had been teaching at this academy for longer than some of the enrolled species had existed as civilizations. He said in that time he had seen extraordinary students. He said he had revised his curriculum 4 times in 9 centuries each time, because a student had taught him something he had not previously understood about what was possible. He said he was revising it again. He said he wanted to tell the assembled students something true, something that would be more useful to them than any score or any trophy. He said when the human exchange cadet Mara Voss had sat in the NHID pod 3 months ago and the machine had reached the top of its scale, and still she had not stopped, he had gone back to his office that night and sat for a very long time. He said he had looked at all his data and all his understanding of biology and all his centuries of experience, and he had found a gap, something he had never properly thought about. He said the galaxy had always sorted its species by what they had been given: armor, venom, size, speed, regeneration, enhanced senses. The species with the most advantages were called the strongest, and the species with the least were called the most vulnerable, and that ranking had been the same for as long as anyone had kept records. He said humans ranked near the bottom of every single category. Then he paused. He said, but that ranking was based on a question the galaxy had been asking wrong. He said the right question was not what did they have. He said the right question was what did they build. He said humans had no armor, so they built courage in a place where armor would have been. He said they had no venom, so they built loyalty instead, something that bonded them to each other in ways no other species had fully replicated. He said they had no regeneration, so they built medicine and never stopped improving it. He said they had no natural weapons, so they built every weapon ever made and then chose most days not to use them, and that second part was the one that should have been in every textbook. He said he had never in 9 centuries needed to rewrite his curriculum for a single student. He was rewriting it now. The room was very quiet. He looked at Mara and said her name and said, "Please stand." She stood. She did not like standing in front of rooms. She had never liked it. It felt like being inspected. It felt like being sized up. And she had spent a significant portion of her life being sized up and found lacking by people who stopped looking too early. But she stood. Gen said the adaptation commendation was given rarely. He said it was not for academic scores. It was given to the student who, in the opinion of the faculty, had most advanced the understanding of what the academy was actually for, which was not the production of isolated excellence, but the creation of beings who could stand beside anyone from anywhere and hold. He said Mara Voss had held. The applause from 400 species sounded like weather. Later, after it was done, after people had come to speak to her, and she had shaken hands and touched antennae and pressed foreheads together in the Govan greeting which Korik had taught her the week before, she finally found the edge of the crowd and stepped through a side door and walked into the noise became a low hum behind walls. She found the observation deck on level 8. It was empty. Through the wide curved glass, the stars were the same stars they always were. She had grown up watching stars from her grandmother's porch in a small city in northern Europe. Her grandmother had told her once that every generation of their family had stood somewhere and looked up and felt small and kept going anyway. She had said that was not weakness. She had said that was a family trade. Mara pressed one hand against the cold glass and looked out. She heard the door behind her. Orendal moved to stand beside her. He did not say anything immediately. He looked out at the stars, too. His amber form caught the starlight and held it softly. He was warm beside her the way things were warm when they were genuinely alive all the way through. He asked her something he had been carrying for months. He said when she smiled in the pod, when the pain was at its highest, when the machine had nothing left and she was still sitting there and she had looked up and smiled. He asked what she had actually been feeling in that moment. The observation deck was quiet the way only space could make things quiet, that absolute dark silence outside the glass that made every sound inside feel more real. Mara looked at the stars for a long time. Then she said honestly she had been feeling relief. She said it still hurt. She said it hurt more than anything she had experienced in a controlled setting. She said her bones felt like they were made of sound, and every nerve in her body was trying to have a conversation with her brain at the same time. But she was still in the chair, and that meant something. She said for humans it had never been about whether it hurt. She said everything hurt sometimes. Everything was hard sometimes. The planet they came from had been making that clear for as long as anyone could remember, cold and dark and full of things that wanted to eat you or flood you or burn you or simply wait you out. The question was never can you avoid the pain. The question had always only ever been can you still stand after it. She said when she felt that pain in the pod and she was still sitting, she smiled because the answer was yes again, still as always. Can you still stand? Yes. Orendal was quiet for a long time. His form shimmered at the edges, a soft light shift that meant deep feeling in his species. Then he said slowly that he thought her species was going to change the galaxy. Not because humans are the strongest or the fastest or the most powerful, not because of the weapons or the medicine or the endurance, but because every other species in the galaxy had something built in to protect them, something biological, something given. And because of that, every other species had a ceiling, a point at which the body simply stopped and said no more. Humans had no such ceiling. They had never been given one. So they had never learned where to stop. Mara looked at the stars. She thought about her grandmother on the porch. She thought about the scar above her eyebrow. She thought about Cork's enormous hands, holding hers in the medical bay, and not letting go. She thought about 4,000 years of calibration data, and a machine that had run out of numbers before she had run out of will. She said she did not know about changing the galaxy. She said mostly they were just trying to get through the day same as everyone else. Orendal made the soft, dissolving sound that was his version of a smile. They stood together at the glass for a long time after that, not talking, just standing the human, and the being of warm light, looking out at the same dark. Outside, the stars were very far away and very cold and completely indifferent to anything that had ever hurt and kept going. But they were still there, and so was she.